One morning, the inhabitants of the greatest city on the planet woke up, ate breakfast, argued with their neighbors over the price of oil, and went to bed in a state that officially no longer existed. No bell rang. No senator stepped onto the forum to weep. The most powerful political machine of the ancient world disappeared, not to the thunder of battle, but to the clink of coins in an ordinary marketplace. How was that possible? How could a state stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the scorching sands of Syria, a state with a metropolis of 1 million people, running water, roads, and a unified legal system, turn into ruins over the course of 3 centuries? The answer is far less cinematic than a barbarian invasion. It was not a single catastrophe, but a long chain of small, almost invisible decisions, each of which seemed reasonable at the time. Perfection with a crack inside. In the 2nd century AD, Rome looked eternal. A single currency circulated from Spain to Egypt. A merchant ship could cross the entire Mediterranean without ever leaving the territory of one state. An urban craftsman lived with a level of comfort that Europe would not match again for another 1,500 years. But behind this impressive facade was an economy structured almost like a financial pyramid scheme. The empire's wealth depended not on production, but on conquest. Legions marched beyond the frontiers and returned with gold and slaves. The slaves worked the estates of the aristocracy. The gold paid for the army, and the army marched out to conquer more territory. The system worked flawlessly, as long as there was somewhere left to expand. By the beginning of the 2nd century, Rome had reached the limits of its own geography. To the north lay impenetrable forests. To the south, the Sahara. To the east stood the powerful Parthian Empire, more than capable of fighting back. Expansion stopped, and with it stopped the flow of new gold and free labor. The cost of maintaining the borders and the army, however, did not disappear. The first warning: a disease no one expected. At roughly the same time, legions returning from campaigns in the east brought an epidemic with them, probably smallpox. The so-called Antonine Plague raged for around 15 years, and according to contemporary accounts, killed as many as 2,000 people a day in Rome. Entire villages in the provinces were wiped out. In the ancient world, people were the most important resource. Fewer farmers meant less grain. Fewer taxpayers meant less money in the treasury. Suddenly, the machinery of the state had become heavier than its own economic foundation could support. Debasing the currency, the brilliant plan that fooled everyone. Faced with an empty treasury and an army that could neither be disbanded nor left unpaid, the emperors found a solution: quietly ruin the money. For centuries, the silver denarius had been a symbol of reliability, containing around 3.5 grams of pure silver. The state began mixing cheap copper into the alloy, at first a little, then more and more. The idea seemed foolproof. The same amount of silver could now be used to mint more coins. But markets cannot be deceived by decree. The more copper appeared in the currency, the faster prices rose. By the middle of the 3rd century, the era's main coin contained roughly 2% silver, and even that was often little more than a thin coating over a copper core, worn away after a few weeks of being carried in a purse. Merchants could see exactly what was happening. They simply refused to sell their goods for increasingly worthless circles of metal. The economy began sliding backward toward primitive barter. When soldiers realized that power was simply force. In 235 AD, an emperor who attempted to pay off Germanic tribes instead of fighting them was murdered by his own soldiers. The legionaries wanted not diplomacy, but the spoils of war. That murder marked the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Roughly half a century, during which more than 20 legitimate rulers and dozens of usurpers claimed the throne. Almost all of them died violently, most often at the hands of their own guards. The army had learned a simple and devastating lesson. There was no sacred authority. There was only physical force. If 30,000 armed men stood behind you, why not put on the purple cloak yourself? One barracks emperor after another climbed onto the throne. And to remain there, each had to shower the army with money. But there was no money. Currency debasement went from a cautious emergency measure to outright farce. While generals fought one another for the throne, the borders were left exposed. Germanic tribes began crossing the Rhine and raiding the provinces with little resistance. Then, in 260 AD, something happened that had once seemed unimaginable. The Roman Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king. According to legend, he was later used as a human footstool whenever the king mounted his horse. The empire literally split into 3 pieces. Diocletian, salvation at the cost of freedom. The state was eventually stitched back together, but saving it required a complete transformation of society. Emperor Diocletian divided power among 4 rulers so that threats could be confronted simultaneously at opposite ends of the empire. He also abandoned increasingly useless, devalued money in favor of taxation in kind. Farmers would now pay the state not in coins, but in sacks of grain, livestock, and oil. To feed an enormous army, now roughly doubled in size, and an expanding bureaucracy, the government legally bound people to their professions and their land. The son of a blacksmith was required to become a blacksmith. The son of a soldier was expected to become a soldier. A farmer could not leave his land under threat of severe punishment. A society once famous for its social mobility effectively froze in place. An attempt to freeze prices by decree, the famous edict on maximum prices of 301 AD, produced a predictable result. Goods simply disappeared from the markets and moved underground into the black market. The borders became more secure. But the price was enormous. Free citizens had, de facto, begun turning into serfs trapped beneath a gigantic state machine. Some farmers voluntarily fled across the borders to live among the barbarians, anything to escape Roman tax collectors. Huns, drought, and a people on the edge of desperation. The final act began not in Rome, but thousands of kilometers to the east, on the steppes of Asia. It appears that the region experienced severe climatic changes and prolonged drought, depriving nomadic peoples of their grazing lands. A vast mass of warlike horsemen known as the Huns began moving west. Ancient writers describe them with undisguised horror as men who seemed fused to their horses, fighting with lightning-fast raids and storms of arrows instead of conventional formations. The first people standing in their path were not Romans, but the Goths, a Germanic people who had lived alongside the empire for centuries. Defeated and demoralized, the Goths fled toward the Roman frontier on the Danube. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, begged to be allowed onto Roman territory, offering military service in return. To Emperor Valens, it looked like an excellent bargain. Thousands of ready-made soldiers without the cost of recruiting them. The order was given to admit the refugees. But on the ground, everything turned into a tragedy. Local officials stole the food allocated to the Goths and began selling starving people rotten meat at monstrous prices, according to one account, demanding one child sold into slavery in exchange for a dog. Humiliated beyond endurance, and still armed because Roman officials had negligently failed to confiscate their weapons, the Goths rebelled. Adrianople, the day belief in Roman invincibility, died. On August 9th, 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople, a Roman army of around 40,000 men, under the personal command of Emperor Valens, went into battle against the Goths. The Romans underestimated the strength of the enemy's heavy cavalry. Their intelligence had misjudged the enemy's numbers. Their soldiers were exhausted by marching and thirst. The Goths deliberately set fire to the grass, sending smoke into the Romans' faces. The result was catastrophic. Roughly two-thirds of the Roman army died on the battlefield. The emperor himself was killed. This was more than a lost battle. In a single day, a professional Roman field army had effectively disappeared, an army that would have taken decades to rebuild. The empire no longer had those decades. For the first time, barbarian leaders had learned through direct experience that a Roman army could be completely destroyed. Afterward, Rome formally accepted something unprecedented within its own territory, a state within a state. The Goths were allowed to live under their own leaders and according to their own customs in exchange for military service. A precedent had been created. Outsourcing security and the price of dependence. From there, events followed an increasingly familiar pattern. Roman citizens avoided military service in growing numbers. Some even mutilated their own fingers to escape conscription. The empire increasingly began purchasing the defense of its borders from barbarian leaders. It was easier to pay a Germanic chieftain in gold than to spend years recruiting, training, and equipping Roman soldiers. At first, the solution appeared successful, but gradually, the distinction between a Roman legionary and a foreign barbarian almost disappeared. Sometimes they were literally relatives, living on opposite sides of the frontier. By the beginning of the 5th century, some of the highest commands in the Western Roman army were held by men of non-Roman origin, whose troops were loyal personally to them rather than to an abstract state. If the treasury stopped paying, the soldiers either switched sides to whoever offered more, or began looting the very provinces they were supposed to defend. The night the Rhine froze. In the winter of 406 AD, an event occurred that became one of the final breaking points. Fleeing the Huns, enormous groups of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi gathered on the Germanic bank of the Rhine, a natural frontier that had held back invasions for centuries. On the night of December 31st, the river reportedly froze unusually hard. Thousands of people poured across the ice with wagons, livestock, and families. Frankish frontier troops serving Rome attempted to resist them, but were overwhelmed. By then, most regular Roman troops had already been transferred to Italy to defend against other threats. Gaul was left virtually defenseless. The migrants swept across the province, burning towns. Not because they had set out to destroy civilization, but because they were desperately searching for somewhere to survive. The central government in Ravenna, protected by its surrounding marshes, could not send meaningful help. And the outer provinces began to understand something dangerous. If Rome could not even protect its own heartland, it certainly could not protect them. The sack of the Eternal City. In 410 AD, a Gothic army commanded by Alaric, a former Roman officer who had served the empire for years and demanded only the land and payment he believed had been promised to him, laid siege to Rome. After the emperor repeatedly refused negotiations, and after starvation inside the city grew so severe that rumors of cannibalism began to circulate, slaves opened the gates from within. 3 days of looting left Rome physically less damaged than one might imagine. Alaric reportedly restricted indiscriminate killing and ordered Christian churches to be spared, but the psychological impact was devastating. For the first time in 8 centuries, the Eternal City had fallen to foreign invaders. The belief that Rome was the unshakable center of the world collapsed forever. Contemporaries, including Christian writers of the period, describe the event as an unimaginable catastrophe for civilization itself. Losing the breadbasket, North Africa. Rome could survive losing its capital. What it could not survive was losing its most important source of food and tax revenue. North Africa, roughly modern Tunisia and Algeria, supplied Italy with enormous quantities of grain and continued paying taxes in gold, even while other provinces burned. In 429 AD, the Vandals under King Gaiseric crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. By 439, they had captured Carthage, the second most important city in the Western Roman world. In a single blow, the empire lost one of its most valuable tax bases. Worse still, Gaiseric seized control of Roman naval resources and transformed the formerly land-based Vandals into a formidable maritime power, dominating much of the Western Mediterranean. Rome was eventually forced to recognize the independence of the Vandal kingdom. In 455, the Vandals systematically sacked Rome once again. It was from this episode that European languages would later derive the word vandalism. Why many ordinary people felt relieved. By the middle of the 5th century, the gap between enormously wealthy senatorial families and an increasingly impoverished population had reached an extreme. Large landowners often escaped much of the tax burden. The cost of maintaining the state therefore fell disproportionately on small farmers and merchants, many of whom were relentlessly driven into ruin by tax collectors. Paradoxically, the arrival of barbarian kings sometimes came as a relief. A new ruler might take a portion of the land for his warriors, often around one-third. But in return, the cumbersome and corrupt Roman tax system could be replaced by simpler and more predictable obligations. Many ordinary people, and even entire communities of landowners, preferred paying less to a barbarian king than supporting a powerless emperor in Ravenna. The state was literally losing the financial foundation required for its own existence. And as the money disappeared, so did the army. Soldiers who had gone years without proper pay simply went home. The quiet ending. By 476 AD, almost nothing remained of the Western Roman Empire except Italy itself, and even Italy was protected largely by a Germanic mercenary army. When the commander of that army, Odoacer, demanded land for his soldiers and received an arrogant refusal from the regime's effective ruler, he simply overthrew the government. He then sent the imperial regalia, the robe, the diadem, the symbols of office, to Constantinople, to the Eastern Roman Emperor. The message was brutally pragmatic. The West no longer needed a separate emperor. The last Western emperor, a 16-year-old boy, was not even executed. He was granted a lifetime pension and sent to live out his days on a luxurious estate. The Roman Senate itself accepted the new arrangement, apparently regarding it as a reasonable administrative solution. No one standing there fully understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. The next morning, ordinary people simply went to the market to buy fish. What came after? The real collapse unfolded afterward, quietly over decades. Without a unified state budget, there was no longer anyone capable of maintaining the aqueducts, and great cities began losing access to reliable water supplies. The population of Rome, once around 1 million, eventually fell to only tens of thousands. Without effective protection, roads became increasingly dangerous. Long-distance trade declined. Literacy became concentrated among a much narrower segment of society. Technologies and specialized knowledge, including some Roman construction techniques, were lost or forgotten for centuries. Even barbarian kings who genuinely tried to preserve Roman institutions struggled to maintain a complex civilization, using the resources of relatively small successor kingdoms. And that, perhaps, is the central lesson of the entire story. A high level of civilization clean water from a tap, safe roads, functioning laws, accessible trade, is not humanity's natural default state. It is an expensive and fragile structure. And it depends on trust. Trust in money, trust in institutions, and trust in the system as a whole. Rome did not fall from a single fatal blow. Slowly, over the lifetimes of several generations, it lost one supporting pillar after another. Until one morning, there was simply nothing left worth ringing the bells for. Thank you for watching.